Hello, this is John from the Gadeon Corporation. Today I just want to talk a little bit about, what kinds of things do we actually look at when we're looking to make an investment in a company? And, one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video is because, two things. I was already going to do another Excel video. I was going to originally do it on like data cleansing, but lately I've been in a lot of discussions about how to make investments in or some stuff around investment advice, right? So I've been in a lot of these discussions recently. So I wanted to discuss this. Now, one thing that you'll notice is that, so first I do have a URL here. We're going to use this for data import because I did want to show, what kinds of things do you actually look at and how do you get this into an Excel sheet rather than showing, on the website you can find, another equity research model on Capcom and on Prothena. And so you can check those out. But, I wanted to show a more heuristic way of doing this. The other point is to say that when you are going through investments, it is not just a matter of checklists of items. Yes, there are things you should look at. So, things that everyone does, like assess management quality and take a look at the operations of the business. But I don't think that anyone should get it in their head that just because you go through a checklist of items that you'll be making a good investment. There are a lot of things that require a sense of artistic opinionation and creativity, depending on how you're trying to invest and what you're investing in. So, for example, if you're investing in the stock market, you very much need to come up with a new thesis to make above market returns. And if you can't do that, then why not just invest in the market aggregate, like the S&P 500, for example. And if you want a unique thesis, then you're not going to achieve that by going through a checklist of items. So, for example, while a DCF or a discounted cash flow model is basically necessary to do your equity research valuation, that's not what actually gives you the value add of the research. The value add comes from the way that your assumptions change the outputs of the model. So it's better to understand the process than to just have a checklist of items. So, we want to go through, some things. We want to understand why these things are important and what kinds of things do we look at. So, for example, one thing that I mentioned was management quality. If you're making an investment where, and again, there's different kinds of investments. I suppose we kind of talk forever about all the different aspects of investments. Management quality is obviously very important for any public investments, right? Does the board know what they are doing? Do they have a good track record, perhaps? Have you read any of their opinion pieces and, maybe what their overall strategy is for the next year? And in a lot of cases, if you're making a public investment without getting heavily involved with the companies themselves, that can be very difficult to assess because say for example you're looking at the 10K of a company, the strategy depicted in the company's annual report /10K is going to be very cursory, I would say. So it's difficult to know if management actually has any idea what they're doing or if they're simply going through the motions of this is our strategy. It is, frankly, fairly traditional. Okay, so what other kinds of things do we want to look at? Obviously, we want to look at the cash flows of the business. We want to look at the business model. How does the business make money? How does it plan to make money in the future? Is the business model sustainable? Is it susceptible to market fluctuations slash dynamics? Which brings in another very important point. I want to look at the market dynamics. And in particular, how do those things affect the investment opportunity for our horizon? Because you might not be investing for 30 years. You might be investing for like 10 years or 5 years. And so we want to understand, will this business be stable in a 5-year period, provided I'm making a long investment. And if you're watching a video like this, maybe you shouldn't be making a short investment anyways, but a long investment, you might want to know if it's going to be stable over the period that we're looking at. Okay. Or if you're making a private investment too, that can be very important, like an acquisition as well. Okay, so what other things we want to know? Is the business scalable? I guess other players in the market, we tie into market dynamics. We generally look at things like Porter's 5 forces, and there's other frameworks too. For example, like Porter's 5 forces is generally for external forces. So things like, for example, the threat of new entrants is one of Porter's 5 forces. One thing that's worth mentioning too, though, is a lot of people sometimes misinterpret Porter's 5 forces as investing in good or bad industries, when really it's more like a framework used to understand the industry dynamics. Sort of like how, if you had thought the only way to have a successful company was through economies of scale, you'd also be kind of wrong in that you can also use economies of scope. So there's different interpretations of, I think, things that are commonly used that are not always accurate. But Porter's 5 forces is used to understand industries, not to say de facto whether or not whether they are good or bad. Okay, but obviously SWOT analysis, which I was going to mention when I talk about external forces. This is for internal forces, typically. Now you can use this to compare across companies, and what you put that into is like something like an evaluation matrix. I'm not a fan of breaking everything down into I guess I am, but memorizing everything. Let's put it like that. So for example, you can change this also to like internal factor evaluation matrix, external factor evaluation matrix. But the idea is that we mix components and look at factors and give them comparative scorings across companies and within companies. In other words, we want to know what's good or what's bad about companies relative to themselves and others. Fairly straightforward. And then what I would say is, for example, and you don't have to do this, but if you understand strategy well, we want to know things like, does the company do a good job of taking those factors which it does well or has strengths in? Does it do a good job of tying that into its ability to create competitive advantage or generate sales, etc., in the market? So in other words, strategy is effectively a reflection of how does a company use its strengths, and giving some kind of a rating to that. Okay, so that kind of gives a good idea of like the different kinds of things that we want to know. We want to know, is the business performing well, and is it going to perform well in the future? And that's essentially the question we're trying to answer. Is it going to perform well in the future? Doesn't necessarily mean it's done well in the past. And one thing that I mention quite a lot is that historical data, and you'll also read about this a lot in the CFA curriculum, does not always reflect the future because of the innumerable changes that can occur. to change the future relative to the past. So, for example, one that was brought up in private equity was when paper printing companies had no longer become a good investment because of the transition to digital. That's not to say that paper printing companies are not around at all, but that they are very stagnant. So things like market disruptions can occur to significantly change the outcomes of the future. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about cash flow analysis, because obviously they are a very important component. We're going to take this URL, and basically we're also just going to show a little bit about how to use Excel. So basically, to scrape data from the web, we're going to go to the data tab, and we're going to go to get data. Now you will notice that we do have, oops, I'm not supposed to click on that to show you the other way, but you can click on from web over here as well. But if you click on get data, there's something like miscellaneous sources down here, or sorry, from other sources, yep, right here. And then we go to from web. And there's other ways that you can take the data too, like you can take it from a PDF, which is common. I've found that sometimes you'll find is that taking information from the web may be restricted. So last time I tried to pull the information from a 10K directly from the URL, that didn't work. So downloading that as a PDF can get around that issue, but that's extra steps, so it's no good. So we're going to be taking information from Tesla, Tesla's financials from stockanalysis.com. They've already tabulated the data, and fortunately for financial data like this, it's already very well structured. If you are making a private investment, you'll find that it's almost never well structured, depending on the size of the company. But chances are, if you're an individual, you're probably buying a small business, and the way that most small business owners organize their financial statements is by heuristics and however they feel, effectively, because they're not experts in finance, right? So naturally they're gonna make a lot of mistakes, and it'll make sense to them, and that's fine. But for the person who's buying it, you will have to sort out all that information. Now, a couple things to mention about the data import. So first is we can switch over to a web view to get a good idea of what the website actually looks like. This isn't particularly useful, but you can see what the website looks like that way. The other thing is that we're on the left side. We can select multiple items, which is typically what I do when I'm perusing through like a company's 10K. Here, though, per page, there's really just a single table. I mean, it says there's multiple tables, but this is more like, just splitting data. We're really just looking at the income statement across all these tables, and table 1 is the main one to look at. But yeah, you can see they're slightly formatted differently. It doesn't really matter. We're going to take the top one. Additionally, we do have HTML code and displayed text. You can do some stuff with this, but it is not so useful in Excel. But to give you some ideas, you can still do sentiment analysis or any kind of analysis using frequency of words as one example. Another thing you will notice, and it doesn't matter in this case because the data is already tabulated, there is still structure to this data that you can extract, and it takes time, but there's still structure. So to explain this, you can see that we have the years here, and if we look down, we will find the numbers associated with the revenue. And what you will notice, if you really take a look, is, let me actually just use the keyboard. These numbers, which are not delimited properly, represent the revenue for each of those years. So this is 2025's revenue, for example. It's just, something to keep in mind. Now, there's different reasons why you would use things like sentiment or word frequency. I won't talk about that too much, but one could be to assess, what geographies a company is focusing on, assuming that the frequency of data is correlated with the geography of focus, if that's even an important thing. And you could also use it to figure out, other words that are maybe more important or associated with performance. But typically the classical way to do sentiment analysis is to take news reports and assess them for, words like good or bad about a company, and then tie that back to the stock's performance. So extremely rudimentary stuff. Now, one other thing to mention is that if we click on transform data, this will bring us to the Power Query menu. We're just not going to do that. The Power Query is fine, but I think with the additions to Excel, probably over the last 5 years if I had to guess, really you can do almost all of that stuff from the regular interface, whatever you would call this. And on the other hand, some stuff that you can do from the regular interface is more convenient than doing it from the Power Query menu. So let's add this to a new worksheet. Yeah. So this is pretty much how you import the data. I'll show you the most common issue when you import data. So basically, the most common issue is that these numbers get imported as text. Now, if we were in the Power Query menu, and we can always go back to it, don't get me wrong, we just go to Query and we go to Edit. Actually, I think equals type is, yeah. So yeah, if we go to equals type, we are going to see that these are text values, and I'm just going to explain that before I click enter, because these are left indented. All all integers / numbers get right indented. So let's do that here. So type equals 2, and then basically if we understand that well enough, that's just a text value, right? So we see 2 here, the text equals 2, and the number's 1. So if this were a number, then we get 1. The other thing to mention is that we have this kind of nonsense column, so we're going to get rid of that. So I'm just going to highlight that and click delete. We'll try to get rid of the column here too. Okay, whatever. Should really figure out how to get rid of that. And it doesn't really matter too much. So the other part is fixing the number issue. The most convenient way to do this is to, I don't know how I'm clicking around, I just click on a data and then click text to columns. So basically we can either do this by delimited or fixed width. We're just going to do this delimited, and when we click finish, we skip all the extra process, although we'll go through the delimiter specification on the next one, but you can see now these are all numbers, and if we do test that with type, then we get numbers. So pretty straightforward. I guess I could always just delete this. Yeah. So I used just a keyboard shortcut. One thing I mentioned too about this text to columns is that we cannot highlight multiple columns and run it like that. You can do that in the Power Query menu though, so keep that in mind. So yeah, if you're dealing with many columns, the Power Query menu can be much more convenient to fix this issue. Okay, now what are delimiters? Delimiters are basically just characters that we use to split or create some kind of indication for some action on our text, or sorry, on our fields, whatever they are. In this case, it's text. Now, we can pick one of the standards, and these are usually fine. We can also specify something else, and we can add certain qualifiers. We can also take the delimiters and treat them. So, for example, if we had, let's say, like three commas in a row, clicking on treat consecutive delimiters as one would treat all of those commas as a single comma, which arguably is self-explanatory, but yeah. Okay, but that's just generally, stuff that you can look at. Yeah, but otherwise it's pretty straightforward to do this, and yeah, that fixes the issue. Because the alternative way to do this is not fun. You'd have to like click into all of these like that, and that's yeah, that's just not very fun. Okay, now what kinds of things do we actually analyze once we have a company's cash flows? Well, I mean, we want to know things like what's their profit margins. There's lots of differences between, like, you got to know some stuff to do this. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to be able to teach you all of that. But we want to certainly look at the margins. We also want to look at whether the margins are improving. And if the margins are improving or getting worse, we want to know why. So effectively, the principle is this. We want to know not just what the numbers are, but why the numbers are changing. And a lot of the time we can get some of those answers, at least, from the statements themselves. So I'll give you an example of that. We see that in, 2020, we get a big buff in the margins going from 2020 to 2021, and then we get a decrease in, this is probably 2023 to 2024. So let's take a look at why that could be. And my first guess is probably the expenses went down somewhere, because revenue growing up isn't really good. Growing up, gonna be a big boy now. The revenue going up is not going to affect the margins, so it's almost definitely a case of the relative margins, the cost of goods sold changing. So if we check the operating and the gross margins first, we could be able to find that. We see very clearly, I think it's a change in the gross margins, probably, because most of the change appears to be from the gross margins getting passed down to the operating margins. So here, for example, we have about a 6% difference in the operating margins, and we have 4. So likely COGS now, if like on a relative basis, now if we go and look at that, we see that the gross profit up. We see where's the cost of the rev, right? So here's the cost of the revenue. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're just going to add a new row, and we're just going to see what the percentage is. I don't know what that is. Okay, and we're going to have to fix that. So I don't know if it's useful to talk through the keyboard shortcuts, but basically Control-Shift-Plus added the new row. The Control-V pasted the formula that we had here, and then we're going to go across, and we're going to click Control-1 to bring up this menu. Now, I don't actually need the mouse to do any of this stuff, but it is faster. So if we click Shift, yeah, anyways. So we want to switch this over to percentage. We're going to add 2 decimal points, and then there we go. So the cost of revenue did go down, and then it went up in 2023, but not 2023 to 2024. So this was likely something else. Cost of revenue did go down from 2020 to 2021 in about, the measure that we looked at. So I think that makes sense. Anyways, I'm not going to investigate this anymore. That's fine. It's just ways of looking at things. We can keep digging through and finding different explanations. Some of this is not going to be from the financial statements themselves. A lot of the changes are going to be explained in the 10K. And if you had any single source to look at a company's uh, look at a company and understand it, it's got to be their 10K. It has a lot of information if it's a large public-facing company. If it's not, and you're making a private investment, then that is more complicated, more heuristic, and more based on due diligence process and relative valuation. So, which is also true of public companies. So effectively all the principles stay the same, but different things you can and can't do, and different levels of access to information. Okay, that's kind of what that looks like. That's how you import the data. That's how you look at everything. And those are the kinds of things that we look at when we're looking at a company. But we're really just trying to answer the question of, is the company going to do well in the future? And so anything you think of that would affect that should get factored in. What I would recommend you do is you do take multiple lines of thinking, and maybe for every good point that you have, you should try to come up with something that could be bad, because a good investment is as much about picking something that's going to turn out well as avoiding something that is going to flop. So anyways, I hope this was informative. Subscribe, like the video, share it with your friends and family. That could be amazing. Yeah. Bye.